The Speaking of Cults podcast is presented solely for general informational, educational, and entertainment purposes. The use of information on this podcast or materials linked from it is at the user's own risk. The views, information, or opinions expressed by the host and guests are solely those of the individuals involved and do not constitute medical or other professional advice. Hello and welcome to the Speaking of Cults podcast. My name is Chris Shelton, your host. Thank you very much for joining me again this week. And we are going into full-blown cult mode this week. I am welcoming back Ashlen Hilliard. Welcome back to the show. Ashlen is what we might call a cult intervention specialist. Mm-hmm. And she has a website and a service and is a semi-public figure. Ashlen, welcome back. How would you describe yourself?
Thank you for having me on again. It's so much fun to be on with you. My name is Ashlen Hilliard, and I would describe myself as what you said, a cult intervention specialist.
Excellent. Excellent. So we're going to talk finally. I mean, it's been years. In fact, the truth is, while I have described and discussed and broken down, the perils and damages of old style cult deprogramming, and I have laid waste to that whole concept. I absolutely despise everything connected with it. And I have talked about cult interventions and how they are not that. We have never done a whole dedicated show to this. And I have never interviewed somebody.
Oh my gosh.
No,
and you picked me. Why'd you pick me? Why'd you pick me? There's so many good people with many more years of experience. Chris.
It's a start. Come on, Ashlen. You're not cool. Nobody. Come on now.
I feel honored. Well, thank you.
Well, thank you. And thank you for being here. Like I said, this is something that doesn't really get talked about a lot. And as we were talking about a little bit before, some people who have been doing this work for a very long time don't want to come on a mic and talk about it because of various considerations. Ones I agree with sometimes, the ones I don't agree with sometimes. We don't have to go there. But Ashlen agreed to talk about this. I'm keen to do so. I have been involved in interventions. Ashlen has been involved in more. And it's a thing and something to know about. And I want folks out there to have the straight skinny on this. So why don't we go ahead and start with defusing misconceptions about this from history, because there is some history to this. And we don't have to go all the way back to the Middle Ages or anything. This is recent history. But
I was going to take it back to the Middle Ages. I was prepared. I was prepared to go all the way back. I also need you to clarify something for me before we get into it.
Yeah, of course.
What the heck is a straight skinny? I've never heard of that phrase in my life. What is a straight skinny?
Sorry, it's old school. Yeah, that's the straight dope. The real truth.
The real truth. Okay.
There we go. Yeah,
got
the
it.
straight
right.
skinny. The actual.
Right. Got it. The straight skinny.
Rundown.
Love it.
Yes.
Okay. Sorry. Keep going.
There we go. So yeah, this is an important topic because we're treating this pretty lightly right now, but this is actually a very, very important topic to understand because this is sort of what we do to fight cults, right? Media exposure, right? Get the abuses out there, try to get law enforcement involved when applicable. But really, it kind of a lot comes down to families and friends, like with drug addicts. You have a drug addict friend, intervention, right? And this is what we do. But let's go ahead and start with deprogramming, which is not interventions. Deprogramming is an older style stuff, right? So let's go ahead and start with that and clear up, now and then. Where should we start?
Let's start with deprogramming. So a part of this work and my passion for this work is educating people on sort of the ethics of this stuff. I think it's really important that families are informed about their options when trying to figure out how to proceed when they have a loved one in a high controlling group or relationship that they're worried about. Because if you're going to interfere with someone's life, you better have a damn good reason, is what my mentor, Patrick Ryan, says. And he's
Told
been
me the
doing this
same
work.
thing years
Yeah.
ago, and I have embraced that
Yes.
wonderful bit of wisdom.
Yes. And figuring out what can be done both ethically and in a way that reflects what research has showed us on the psychology of someone in groups, um, is a very complex thing. It's a very complex thing, and it's not always black and white. So, in the field, deprogramming, which many people, that is like still to this day the term that is most widely known when it comes to describing intervention work. Most people still know the term deprogramming. I wish that weren't the case, but that's okay because it gives us somewhere to go in history to talk about. So, deprogramming came to the scene after Jonestown happened. That was relatively when it started, was around the mid 1970s. And it continued until the early 1990s. So, cult deprogramming was defined as the utilization of high confrontation methods to share or force information upon a cult involved individual in order to elicit an emotional response. So I'll break down what that looked like and what it meant. But to set the stage, Jonestown had just happened. Families lost loved ones in Jonestown. It was horrific. That was on every major newsstand, newspaper throughout the country about this cult, that this thing happened. And so it sort of stirred about this extreme worry and craze for families that if they suspected their loved one was involved in a group, then the outcome would be something like Jonestown, because there was very few models for what could happen and what this looked like and the dangers of groups. So a lot of deprogrammings happened with the Unification Church. The Moonies was very large during that time. A lot of deprogramming sort of focused on that group because it was a big group. It was sort of seen as like this controversial group, and parents who had children who maybe were involved, that really set off their alarm bells, was especially after the Jonestown era, if I'm getting the timeline right. And I interviewed Patrick Ryan, who he's been doing this work for over 35 years. It's on my YouTube channel about how Jonestown shaped the deprogramming industry and really left an imprint on how people responded. So, what would happen was people would attend like cult related conferences back in the day, families who had someone who they suspected was in a bad group. They wanted information, they needed to know who they could go to for help. And cult deprogrammers sort of rose to the scene, and these were self proclaimed professionals. Many of them knew nothing about cults. They may have been looking to make a quick buck. And really, the father of deprogramming was known as a man named called Ted Patrick. And you can read even just like a Wikipedia page on Ted Patrick, lots of interesting stuff on him and how he got started. But he would organize these teams of people for families. He would offer a solution, and that was merely to forcibly, oftentimes, kidnap their loved one from a cultic environment or an alleged cultic environment. And it could even look as extreme as putting them in a van. That poor young person feels like their life is in danger. They don't know what's going on. There's accounts of people feeling like they were going to die. Horrible, horrible stuff. And taking them to a remote place where they couldn't leave and forcibly telling them why the group they're in is a cult or a bad group. They would read information to them. I mean, it was truly abusive and horrific. And it was not a voluntary process. They were basically held against their will. And the ways that deprogrammings were considered successful was if someone merely just admitted, okay, the group I'm in is a cult. Even if they went back, which many of them did, even if they went back to the group in question, All they had to do for deprogramming to be considered successful was to say, okay, you're right, I'm in a cult. And what the cult started to do was to prime the cult members and their groups and say, we just want you to know deprogrammers are gonna, your family's gonna hire a deprogrammer, they're gonna come and get you. And this echoes to us and for you why we're your only true safe family available. It sort of confirmed that the group was actually a safer place than the family system, who would arrange strangers to kidnap their children. And the theory was just removing them from the physical environment of the group or commune or wherever they were living was enough to get them to sort of snap out of a indoctrinated state.
Right.
Clearly, that wasn't the case. There was a really interesting book that was written called Snapping that would go into and describe that process. You guys can check it out.
Conway and
But
Seagelman, pretty
yeah,
famous book in the field.
yes, Conway and Seagelman. And, basically the programmers, they promised intensive counter brainwashing, which I thought was really interesting. And they wanted members to be not only physically separated from the cult, but they wanted them to like cut ties with the individuals in the group in question. Obviously, due to legal and ethical issues, this process was very secretive and conducted without mental health professionals present.
Right.
Because if mental health professionals were present, they're witnessing an actual kidnapping, abduction. They would then have to report it to their licensure boards. So this went on. Interestingly, there was a research study published in 1984, and I believe it was published by Michael Langone, who did this work back in the day. But it surveyed 94 parents who had children who had become involved in cults. And some of the statistics showed that deprogramming was not only unethical, costly, and high risk, but 68% of the converts were forcibly abducted. This was from the study on 94 parents that was taken. 37% of those people returned to the cult. And that also doesn't account for maybe they didn't return to the cult immediately after, but they did maybe after a period of months. We just don't know.
Right.
Deprogramming required an average of 8.5 days,
Oh.
which is wild to imagine on all accounts.
Especially
And
under those circumstances.
no, it's horrible.
Yeah.
And 10 of the 62 deprogrammings in this study resulted in lawsuits. There was many, many, many lawsuits that occurred. There was this woman, her name was Stephanie Myler. I'm not sure exactly how you pronounce her last name. But her parents hired a deprogrammer because she was in a lesbian relationship. And I have covered this story before on my Instagram channel. You can read her Wikipedia page. She was brutally assaulted by the deprogrammer. I mean, it was just some of the darkest periods of people did not know, and parents were desperate. And unfortunately, deprogrammers only fueled their fears and tried to provide a solution to their desperation. And it ended up in more harm. These cult members cutting off their family members, no avenues for exit, and has left, in some cases, I've met people who have endured intergenerational trauma from what a deprogramming did on their family.
Right.
And there were people in our field who are still around today, people like Pat Ryan and Joseph Kelly, who saw deprogrammings take place and were like, there's a better way than what's going on here. This is terrible. We left our groups on our own. We didn't need anyone to kidnap us. They were in 2 different New Age Eastern philosophy groups. They left and they were like, why is the proposed solution kidnapping? And I think it's important to remember that not only did Jonestown happen, but Heaven's Gate happened, and just anything that parents perceived as cultic just continue to
Well,
fuel desperation.
let's not forget that this, I mean, when you see the series of events through the 70s through the cult lens, if you do some Googling or some searching, Jonestown is a key moment. I believe there was an earlier one I'm not remembering right now, and then it rolls right over in the 80s into the Satanic Panic,
Yeah,
which took America by fucking
it did.
storm on the media channels, and
Right.
people were convinced. Sheriffs, law enforcement individuals were holding workshops and seminars about the satanic problem, with animal sacrifices and murders, and it was a hotbed of misinformation and profit motive, I believe, disinformation being forwarded. Everything, we were talking about here was all happening with that as the background in America. And if you were around back then, you remember how wild it was. It went on for years, and people went to jail, and there were cases, and it was a real kind of hysterical time when it came to that. And that was all kind of I see it all as one
Hmm.
series of events.
There was a lot of hysteria.
Yeah,
And deprogramming's continued. Ted Patrick, many people face lawsuits who were involved in deprogrammings. Um,
didn't
and
Patrick go to jail?
I believe he did.
Yeah, he spent jail time for for
Jail
for
time.
breaking the law. Yeah.
Yeah. I know that Rick Ross faced a lawsuit. I mean, just
Mhm.
lawsuits, lawsuits, lawsuits from
Yep.
deprogramming.
Yep.
And then in the 1980s, we move on to interventionists who sought to distinguish themselves from the practice of deprogramming, and they refer to themselves as exit counselors. So
Mm.
that's where the term exit counseling comes into play.
Right.
And they wanted to adopt a much more voluntary and educational approach to these sort of interventions. But even within the field of exit counseling, there was more divisions that arose. Some practitioners were emphasizing specific techniques or even religious perspectives, while other people focused on just providing information. And another problem became that anyone could call themselves an exit counselor. And in terms of like exit counseling and deprogramming, they were often used interchangeably, and it caused a lot of confusion. And these labels failed to indicate their actions, competence, ethics, or approach.
Right.
And so this is where another label shifts. So there's a lot of like, I'm covering the history of this because people often hear deprogramming, exit counseling, thought reform, intervention, and it's confusing. So I'm trying
Yeah.
to like walk through this in sort of a timeline fashion. But in the early 1990s, which is also when deprogramming came to a halt because of the lawsuits and the criminal application involved of kidnapping, abduction.
Yeah.
In the early 1990s, there was a move to professionalize and establish competency criteria. And a group of consultants, Carol Giambalvo, who's since passed on, Joseph Kelly, Patrick Ryan, and Madeline Tobias, developed ethical standards and referred to themselves as thought reform consultants. So they published these ethical standards for thought reform consultants in the Cultic Studies Journal back in 1996. And this was the first time that like ethical standards has come out to try to sort of formalize a way to make themselves different than deprogrammers.
Right.
And
And this was a voluntary activity. This was, hey,
right.
we're throwing this out there for anybody who's doing this work. We think you should sign on. There's no regulatory body. It's not like there was some oversight or some, inspection activity or something, but it was a beginning. It was a, hey,
Yeah.
here's some things we should be doing, and here's some things we shouldn't be doing.
Hmm.
Let's sign on to this. It was that kind of thing, right?
Right. And it was, according to the ethical standards, thought reform consultation offers insights into the principles and practical applications of thought reform through open dialogue, educational resources, and personal testimonies. It also adheres to ethical and legal standards, ensuring respectful and informative experiences. They were patterned after the ethical code of standards for the American Association for Marriage and Family Therapy, the National Association of Social Workers, Standards for the Private Practice of Clinical Social Work, American Psychiatric Association, and the National Academy of Certified Clinical Mental Health Counselors.
Yeah.
So, in both exit counseling and thought reform consultation, the purpose of the intervention, they say, is not to get someone out of a cult. Well, that is the desired outcome of maybe the parents. The purpose is to give the group member the information that then enables them to make a fully informed choice.
There you go.
So that was the distinguished differences. To this
So you can see
day,
that's a practically night and day
yes.
attitude shift from what Ted Patrick was doing, which was more of a desperation and
Mm-hmm.
slash criminal sort of approach to this thing. Like, and the end justify the means kind of
Right,
approach. Yeah.
right. Absolutely. And now the term is cult intervention specialist. The reason I decided to make that shift for calling myself cult intervention specialist just for me is purely because of Google and SEO. And also, when parents are worried about a cult involved person, they don't know the term thought reform. They're
Right.
not going to type into Google thought reform consultants near me.
That's right. That's right.
And so Pat, Joe, and I, and other people who work in this field have shifted to cult intervention specialists
Yeah.
because that does provide families a place to go who are looking for help and support. And I subscribe to the ethical standards. It has different sections and components on, for example, if you're going to call yourself someone who does interventions in this field, a large portion of your work and time needs to be devoted to volunteer work, whether that's continuing education, presenting at conferences, doing work that people can access for free who don't have the means to pay you as a consultant for your time. And that's really important. You're offering education and guidance and really community service to people. But obviously for complex cases, that's really important as well. I also work alongside a specialized team. We involve utilizing mental health therapists, and we have a psychiatrist who we often bring in as well. We have legal professionals who we call if we have questions. And so just depending on the case, we really just bring in a team that fits the need for the case or the situation so that we aren't stepping outside of our scope. My scope is I am the strategy person, I am the educational person, and my scope is not providing mental health therapy. That is not my scope. And so working alongside someone who can provide that is essential.
Yeah.
Knowing where your experience and your expertise stops and ends, I think is really important. And there is no formalized way to go about doing this work. Reading through the ethical standards for thought reform consultants, it certainly paints a picture of what's ethical, even in how you market yourself. I have never and will never put out some sort of percentage as to success rate because it would be akin to like a therapy office or a therapist saying 99% of my clients no longer have anxiety. It doesn't sit well with me. And it's also in the marketing ethics too. It's like the problem with intervention work is when you think about something like drug and alcohol interventions, how families see that as successful or non-successful is if that individual gets on a plane and goes to rehab that day. That is like the measure for success.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to someone who is under the influence of a high control group or relationship, you can present the information, then they're on their own timeline. We see sort of their ability to sit with information. Sometimes that's shorter for people, sometimes that's longer for people. And also, each family has a different goal. Sometimes families don't care if their loved one is a part of this group. They just want to be able to have access to them and see them around holidays or birthdays. And it's more of a mediation, conversation. Like, how
Right.
can we find a way to negotiate that?
Right.
And so, because every family's goal is different, and because we don't measure success off of someone deciding to leave a group after we've had one conversation with them, because that's not realistic. I don't break down, I don't market myself as someone who guarantees success with this stuff. And how you even measure success with thought reform and indoctrination and coercive control, there's not like a concrete way to measure that.
Not really.
Um,
Not really,
yeah.
especially if you're looking for instant results, because as people I've worked with for years know, it can take 2 or 3 years to get somebody out.
Yes. And
If you're
part of
just in
our
seed,
job,
if you're just
yeah.
in seed planting mode and you're not trying to, get in their face about it, it's
Mhm.
subtle work. It's not
It's
always in your face work.
and it's important that we educate the families about that. This is
Yeah.
long game stuff. This is long game stuff. And that's part of our ethical conversations up front.
Yeah.
You can't expect as a family to call us in, to talk to your loved one twice, and then us to say the magic phrase to convince them to leave a group.
Yeah.
It is incredibly much more nuanced than that. It is a very complicated, complex process. And it also involves changing the entire family system. Sometimes the families approach us and they want us to help their loved one. But as we're doing, we oftentimes start with an 8-hour assessment. We interview family members. We figure out what's been done, what's been tried, what's worked, what's not, learn more about the group that's involved. And we start to realize the family dynamics or the ways that family members have responded have contributed to this sort of problem. And look, no family's perfect in how they respond to this stuff. I never want families to feel bad for that, because how are families supposed to know? There's just no education on this. But part of the work is also looking for change in focusing on the family system. Because if we can eliminate and reduce shame and judgment in the family system, that cult involved person, when they are ready for a change or they are frustrated with their current group, there's a much clearer landing zone back into the family system. If we can reduce the feelings of angst and shame and guilt, and you did this to me, and how could you join this thing? We want to be able to reintegrate everybody. And that's the work. Not many people realize that's the work.
Oh,
Um,
I was going to ask you because I've only done a few of these and it's been very obvious to me in each, yeah, and the ones that I've done, that the dysfunctional family dynamics, and I don't mean to, I say dysfunctional, I mean, there's gradations of this. Okay. It's not a
of
black and white
course.
thing, right?
Yeah.
Families are complex. Any family counselor will tell you that. I mean, there's just all kinds of things to know about this. But where I'm going with this is, have you noticed that sometimes the reason the person's in the group, like it becomes very obvious to us who are a little bit more objective outside observers, oh, the family's kind of, the dynamics of this are kind of why the guy's in the
Hmm.
group, and so you can't just expect that you're going to go talk to one aspect of this and fix everything, because that's that person's in that group because they're hiding from the family, or they don't want to be in the family, or or there was abuse in the family that nobody's acknowledging, and these things tend to come to light when
Yeah.
during these
Oftentimes,
things. Yeah.
if there is dysfunction or abuse or harm within the family system, it is a contributor to
Right.
someone finding community elsewhere. Um, or, cutting off their own family and difficulty with reestablishing connection and relationship. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And what we offer is a way to, support the families as they go through this process with their loved one and talk to them about the ethics of, here's different routes that you've explored. Here's the risk many times families just don't know. And so they want you to come in and have more of a, I guess the way I start with families is intervention can mean the term a lot of different things. It's a very loaded term. We think of the show intervention, and that's like drug and alcohol related. We can't treat people in high control environments as addicts.
It's
It
not
is
the
a
same.
it is a totally different thing.
Hmm.
And when we say intervention, it's really interesting. What my team and I do is, to the best of our ability, we want to be able to contribute. Essentially, we're do no harm. We don't want to add any, I guess, like any more problems into the family system that could continue to maybe cut someone off or distance them further from their family. And so the way we go about that is we start very slowly, interviews, gathering information, seeing what's worked, what's not worked, doing our own independent research if needed, and seeing if we can reestablish rapport with someone already existing in the family system. Not with us, not with strangers coming in, but can we work through someone in the family system and provide them with some coaching and some tools so that there's an open line of dialogue and communication between them and the loved one who's in a group? That's really important to us. And if it is a more extreme circumstance, then we will, you know, adapt our approach and see what can be done. Is there an opportunity for us to go in and meet this person and talk to them? But what makes sort of our approach very different is it's extremely consensual. They have to want to talk to us. The person in the group has to want to see us being there as beneficial to them and their family and how they're navigating the situation. We align ourselves with the member who's in the group. And at any point, if they say this isn't beneficial, then we have the ability as consultants to pull out of the situation and not contribute any more harm to the existing dynamics. We have to give ourselves that room and that flexibility. If we were to go straight into a let's gather up a team of 30 people, figure out an approach, go into talking to this person, that is the most risky thing you could do. And what our approach is we want to see if we could find a way into the system and also be able to pull back at any point if this isn't valuable for that individual, for the family anymore. And so I know that this is like very complex and vague, but that's sort of big picture, like how we see interventions. A lot of our work doesn't end up in any sort of intervention. We're working within the existing family system and with the relationships, but sometimes it does.
Yeah, fair enough. Let's go ahead and throw something out for folks. Maybe some people have seen this. It's an older one, in 1999. Did you ever see that movie, Holy Smoke?
No.
Oh,
I was born in
Jane.
95, so I would have been
Okay, Jane
4.
Campion made this film. Harvey Keitel plays a deprogrammer.
Okay.
And he goes
Holy
and
smoke.
tries to deprogram Kate Winslet, who's joined an
Mm.
Indian guru kind of cult thing, and it's in Australia that this happens, and so there's this Australian family, and he goes down there, kind of being Mr. Tough Macho guy, and the film I throw it out because it is a a case study in everything not to do,
Yeah,
everything not to do, right? The
yeah,
guy's antagonistic, he's hostile, he's gamey, he's threatening. It becomes sexual. I mean, it gets so off the rails, so off the rails. And the
crazy.
guy is, and Harvey Keitel's character, just plays a complete douche. And that's kind of, one of the points of the movie. But it's one of the few
Mm.
places where you see a fictionalized account of what the kind of stuff we're talking about, like kind of what it looked like in the
Yeah.
90s when there was this sort of like old school approach, kind of being married with they show some education happening and some other things happening in the film, but it's all sort of, the tone is way off. I didn't like the movie personally, but that's because it wasn't really trying to portray cult intervention. It was trying to tell this dramatic story, right, between these two wild characters. But it is an example of something you can go look at that is definitely what not to do.
It's my next weekend watch. I'll write a
Yeah,
blog post on it or
it's a
something.
fun
Yeah.
one.
Yeah.
It's a fun one. Yeah. Anyway, so the other thing I wanted to say that I have sort of tried to throw out there as an easy way to think about all the things that you have said is, you're not going to get somebody out of a cult by using cult methods on them.
Mm-hmm.
And that's pretty much what Patrick was all, Ted Patrick and that crew was all about, right? Kidnapping and all the rest. So this is very interesting, that sometimes it doesn't even get to some kind of a confrontational or conversational or whatever direct thing between y'all, your team, and the person who's in the group. Sometimes you can navigate it without even having to go there.
Yeah. Most of the time it doesn't.
Most of the time. That's cool.
I'd say most of the time. And back in the old days, it was different. It was really interesting because Pat and Joe's sort of model of this is what I have been learning and applying, and also trying to see, like, does this still fit within the modern context? And like, as we move forward in our current era. And it's been interesting because Pat really got started in the 90s with Scientology cases. And his approach was, if one of these Scientology intervention fails, Scientology will sue us and we will have nothing. And he had Scientology follow him all the way to Australia and put him in a court in Australia. I mean, he's got wild stories about doing Scientology cases.
Yeah.
And so it was doing so many interventions with Scientology that he started developing with Joe Kelly and Joseph Zimhart back in the day, this approach of moving extremely slowly into this. And you need to be able to back out at any time without contributing more harm to the situation. Yeah. And I really appreciate that. I really enjoy doing, like, we do an 8-hour assessment with families and really getting into the weeds of the situation. And we leave them with recommendations. Sometimes that recommendation is, hey, your loved one might want to talk to us for an intervention. But most of the time it's, how can we work within the family system to improve the communication, the dialogue, the dynamics? Because the research shows that most people who join groups leave on their own. And it's not perfect research and it's outdated research, but that's what we have to go on. And it's also true for so many survivors who've been in groups like you, Chris. Like, that is like what we know is what we don't know is how long people are committed to being in that group. For some, it's 3 months. For some, it's 13 years. And they are going to need somewhere to go once they decide that group is not good for them anymore, or they get kicked out, or they're exhausted from what the group is demanding of them. And if the family is no longer a safe space because of the harm that's been caused in the process, then that makes it very difficult for reunification to happen and integration back into society to happen. And sometimes the family isn't a safe space, and we work with that too. Sometimes we work with people who are like, the family doesn't care about this, but we're 3 of their closest friends and we really care. And so we'll work with the friends. So yeah, that's a little bit about that.
Sure. Let me ask you about the educational component, because I think this is a real key and takes a lot of time.
Yeah.
Working with the friends and family. What, there's, every case is different. So let's say that right from the get-go. There's no pattern. I mean, there's general things that you do over and over again, but every case is unique. Is that, would that be an accurate statement?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So in terms of what education you're going to get, it could
Mhm.
vary, but I'm curious in general terms, what are you trying to get across to people?
Part of my role as sort of this strategy education person is to get families to a place where they are thinking they're thinking like almost the cult member would think. I know that's like takes a second to wrap your head around, but families, because they're obviously so close to the situation and those relationships are so close and they're really emotional. I try to move families to a place of, almost anticipation what their loved one's next move might be and why. And how can we sort of flip the dynamic on its head? The cult member may expect the family to react a certain way to a situation, for example. So, how do we, in advance, work with the family and show them this is how you can respond in a way that's counterintuitive to what they're going to expect you to do? And that is a good thing. Again, it creates opportunities for cognitive dissonance. For example, in many groups or relationships, you might have someone who is the gatekeeper over the person involved in the group. And by the gatekeeper, that could be the cult leader, that could be a one-on-one relationship, maybe a spouse, if it's like a destructive individual relationship. Um, and something that I talk to the families a lot about is your loved one may be reflecting the views of the group or group leader or narcissistic spouse or something like that. And it may be hurtful what they're saying to you. And I don't want to be dismissive of that because it can be incredibly painful what a cult involved person can say as a means to lash out to the family because they're not feeling understood. But what we want to do is, in order to have more access to your loved ones, sometimes we need to signal to the gatekeeper over them that you pose no threat, that you are a safe person, you're not going to sway that individual. Sometimes a way to do that is to find ways to speak to the gatekeeper, to sometimes stroke their ego, to make it seem like you're maybe united on one particular issue that they're united on. Um, if a gatekeeper, whatever that is, suspects you to be a threat, they are going to encourage your loved one who's in a cult to continue to withdraw, to lash out. And so, if we can find a way to lower the volume via appealing to the gatekeeper, that is a form of strategy that usually yields very interesting results. It sort of confounds the system. And we love confounding the system. It sort of puts them in their own sort of query and bind, right? It creates that double bind. And so that's part of the education and strategy that I work with families to develop is, what have you tried? Here's here's how I think they may respond to your approach. And let's alter that and see if that changes the results. It's a lot of education about thought reform, what people are like in these cultic systems, um, and also the process of being in a group is like you love it, you hate it, you're at a retreat and it's great, you're exhausted, you're broke. I mean, you're just all over the map. And so, even if outwardly that person to the family is still gun ho in the group, internally they may not actually be feeling that way. So, I talk to the families a lot about that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I was miserable in Scientology for years before I finally got out. Had somebody, convinced me a few years earlier that there was a support system waiting for me outside and I could have
Mhm.
had a soft landing, I would have been able to leave much
Mhm.
earlier. Not that it's on anybody else. I'm just nobody even tried. And it's, anyway, I think you get my point. I'm not blaming
Mhm.
anybody for that. Um, on the points of education about thought reform and about what's going on in cults, how does that usually go for you guys? It seems a difficult topic for some people to get their heads around because they have other core beliefs about responsibility or about individual choice or about how it's, it's always on the person, and and these kind of things kind of get in the way sometimes, I would imagine. Yeah, no, or does it usually go smooth as silk?
It usually is. I mean, we've gotten families who have done a lot of education and
Mm-hmm.
reading before reaching out, which is
Mm-hmm.
great. And then sometimes we have families who are sort of at the beginning and they have no idea what resources to look into and what to consume in terms of information. And we just
Right.
always find ways to meet them where they're at and also not overwhelm them with information. We don't
Right.
recommend 10 books that they read.
Right. Exactly.
Not right off the bat, at least.
Right.
And we just look for ways to meet them where they are and figure out what resources they need that are especially applicable to the situation they find themselves. And I think one of the challenges that we run up against when working with families is there's sort of this like if a family member has a loved one who maybe, and this has happened in many, many groups that I've worked with and families I've worked with, where maybe they're about to get married to a cult member,
Mm.
or maybe they're about to like go through the process of becoming an official member of the group. A lot of these like really big life things, um, family members get really distraught over this. And again, I'm not trying to sound cold. I completely understand why that would be extremely distressing. It's valid and very concerning. But at the same time, big life events for people in these group settings, it doesn't mean it's the end. It doesn't mean it's the end. Cult involvement has its own journey, has its own timeline. And even if they are engaging in things that maybe they live in a commune for a while, or maybe they move out of state from the family, these things can be very concerning. But I think sometimes it's easy for families to say, well, this must be the end. And part of our role is to say, it's not the end. You can't give up on this person. You are here doing the work. You are trying to find ways to like you are advocating for them behind the scenes. And sometimes it's difficult for loved ones to go to professionals and talk about the situation because they feel like they're talking behind someone's back.
Mm.
And that's something that we talk to them a lot about is you have very valid concerns. Um, and they're totally reasonable, and we're here to offer support. Sometimes family members feel guilty for talking about their son, daughter, child behind their back.
That's
And
interesting.
I think it's part of and sometimes that's also instilled maybe in particular religious cultures as well as labeled as gossip, for example.
Sure.
Um, but I found this poster. Hold on. Found this poster recently, and I really like it.
Huh.
And I
Gossip
know
saves
And I
lives.
know it's probably backwards on the Zoom screen, but sometimes what people can attribute negatively talking about someone that they're concerned about with professionals or not with them involved directly in the conversation. But sometimes it's because you're trying to advocate for them behind the scenes, you're trying to help them, you don't know how. You need support as well. Like family members need as much support as people, you know, who get involved in these groups. I think cult involvement affects everyone just in different ways. And part of our role is to help them not feel alone and give them places to explore and ways to go and talk to them about the ethics of this stuff and help them as best we can without contributing any more harm to the situation.
Absolutely. Well, if there was a list of things that family or friends tend to get wrong, err on, mistakes have been made by the time they contact you, what sort of things are there? Like, in other words, if we were going to give advice to people to
Hmm.
okay, don't do these things, right? Even
Yeah.
before you're contacting us, what should you avoid doing, or what are some
This would be my
guidelines that might be
generic,
useful?
yeah,
Yeah,
I call
yeah,
this generic advice
yeah.
because I never feel equipped to give specific advice until after an 8-hour assessment.
Of
But
course.
this is generic advice. It's oftentimes not helpful to get into the weeds about the theology. Um, let's say, for example, you're dealing with someone in a Christian group that's really abusive, trying to debate scripture with them as to why that group is not aligning with scripture. It They have already been primed to counteract all those things.
Yeah,
It's not helpful. And they
yeah.
can also always find a way to bring that information to the cult leader, and the cult leader tell them, well, here's how they're wrong. Um, and I'm sure, Chris, this hits home with you with Scientology, and
All the time.
yeah, you could
All the
always find
time.
a way to like justify why Scientology is correct in that moment. Um,
Well, and my bottom line with that advice, and it's a great piece of advice, I've given the same thing for years, is you're not going to explain what's wrong to Dianetics to somebody who's in Dianetics and Scientology, because they already know, they know more about it than you do.
they're the expert. They're
They're
the
the
expert.
experts as far as they're concerned. And that is a shield that
Hmm.
will barrier any attempt to logically argue them out of their belief. As
Hmm.
ridiculous as the belief may be to you, I think one of the key points getting across to folks during this process is it's very real to them.
Yep.
Yeah. Uh,
Yep.
Please continue. What else you got? This is good.
I got a lot of things.
Yeah.
I think families may be quick to say, we'd love for you to come spend the weekend with us, or, you know, this week with us on a trip. But then if the cult member says no, or I can't, they're very quick to say, why don't you spend time with us anymore? And sort of go into like kind of guilt mode.
Hmm.
And something that Pat and Joe always talk about is it's almost like you want to treat someone who's in a cult as they're like CEO of like a major company in China. They have the burden of demands put upon them. Sometimes family members don't even know those demands of what is expected of them in the cult.
Yeah.
And sometimes being that person who can give them the breathing room of, hey, I know you have a lot going on. If you're able to join us for lunch, very short period of time, would love to have you. But I understand if you can't because you're very busy right now. Just giving someone that freedom to say, I can't come, without making them feel guilty, can be really helpful for someone who's in a cultic environment, who's feeling the weight of demands. And if I don't do this, I'll be in trouble. Um, I think that's really helpful.
I could not agree more. Do you know? Here's Let me make this observation about that, because I think it's great. If we think about Janja Lalich's bounded choice model as they're in an environment where their choices have been stripped from them one after
Hmm.
another, where they are locked into behavior patterns, here's somebody on the outside giving them a choice for once.
Exactly. You're confounding the system.
There
That
we
it's
go.
just another example of confounding the system.
Yeah, there we go.
Um, I think another tip would be always approaching it from the perspective of curiosity. I encourage families that if we want to help someone involved in a group, we have to have some sort of line of communication. Even if that line of communication isn't great, or even if it's inconsistent, having as much of a roadmap as to what's going on in someone's head, as to where they're at on that cult involvement journey or timeline, is very important. And in order to do that, we have to meet them in a place of less criticism and more curiosity. So And it's hard for families, very hard for families. So I encourage them to almost put on their Sherlock Holmes hat, like take the family hat off, put on the Sherlock Holmes hat. We are trying to gather information about what their loved one is doing. Are they working outside the group? How did they seem, even from like a mental health perspective? So there's a lot of information that family members can gain if there's an open line of communication. And that curiosity may look like the cult involved person saying, "This is what I believe." And instead of saying, "That's bizarre" or "That's strange," it's, "Tell me more about that." We're not trying to be too probative. We're not trying to be too, it's a benign curiosity because we also don't want to put someone off if we're asking, "Who were you with last weekend? What were you doing?" But if someone goes to a church that you suspect might be abusive, for example, attend a service with them if you can. If you're able to do that, and it's not a detriment to your own health, mental health, or well-being, um, get insight, get as much insight as you can as
Mm.
to what that environment community looks like. And also realizing what it provides to your loved one, um, is really helpful. It's really helpful.
Excellent. Now, along that line, I usually caution people, don't lie.
Mhm.
Because if you're caught in a lie, it's all over because they won't know
Yeah.
what to believe from you ever again, right? And I was just thinking along that line of being interested, I could not 10,000 thumbs up on being interested, asking questions, finding out more. Would you agree with me to caution against faking like you want to be a member or something? I mean, you don't want to cross lines, right?
Right. I wouldn't recommend joining a group,
Right.
or doing like a weekend retreat with the group.
Right.
That's too
Right.
much. But I think
Right.
you could, if you were invited to like a Sunday barbecue to get to know the community, it'd be interesting to go and see what's going on. Um,
Absolutely.
and see how you're being an observer. It's almost like you want to just be an observer and see how your loved one is interacting with people, how they seem in that situation, what they're doing. There's just so much information that could be gained. Um,
Yeah.
and it's again, I only say that if A, the loved one is willing to do that, B, if it's not a threat, if it's not, if the environment is chill enough that it's not a risk, um, to your own health and safety, of course.
Right.
Um, but also sometimes people are incapable of going into those environments and maintaining a sense of chill,
Right.
to be
Right.
quite
I
frank.
imagine it can be triggering for some people, and they
Yes,
need to know that so that they don't put
yes,
themselves in a bad
yes,
spot.
yes, and have follow up with professionals afterward,
Yeah.
debriefing. Like sometimes what you see may be a little bit disturbing. You may disagree. Don't talk to it about your loved one in the moment. Debrief with people afterward,
Yeah.
professionals who can help you make sense of it all.
Yeah.
But yeah, yeah. And I tell family members it's only if you can maintain a sense of chill. If you can keep it together, it would also signal to the loved one that you're worried about that you do care. You're not just so quick to write off what's going on.
Exactly.
Mhm.
Exactly. That can help repair, even some of that earlier dysfunction or
Yeah,
argumentation or
yeah.
issues.
So those are my three big tips.
Excellent.
Generic advice. Yeah.
Excellent. On that point of deception or lying, how do you see that in terms of relating to someone in a group? Is it ever called for? Are there circumstances, or what? How does that play out?
Like in the
Are there
context,
circumstances where a family member, or a friend, or you, or the
uh-huh.
team may need to deceive the person for what could be considered ethical reasons, or is it just an absolute, just don't do that? I would tend
So,
to err on that side myself, but I can
yeah.
see that there could be exceptions. I just thought what do you think?
So there are times where I have gone sort of undercover in groups
Mm,
that are more extreme,
mm,
to see what is going on, and also get a sense as to maybe how involved that loved one is. Maybe there's a lot of stuff written on, let's say, Reddit about the group in question, or I'll give you an example. There was a political group that
mm,
I found a way to get involved in for a period of time. And it was actually extremely complex. I had to like befriend the leader of the group, and it was very secretive. And we kind of just had basic questions of, is this actually a harmful environment? Because the communication between the loved one and that family member became so strained. The families had a lot of concern, but we weren't sure if that concern was actually real and accurate. And so I was able to get into this group, and I didn't interact with the loved one who was in that group. I just was sort of a fly on the wall to observe this group. Is it harmful? Is it benign? What's going on here? And I did not go in for the purpose of telling this person that they should leave this group. That would be uncool.
mm,
I wanted to go in and hopefully alleviate or confirm the family's concerns about what was going on.
mm-hmm.
And so there have been instances where I've done that.
Okay.
But they're very rare. And it also has to make sense. There has to be no communication. The loved one may be at extreme risk. I mean, there's there has to be like circumstances that justify for that sort of action.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, of course. Yeah, I doubt that there are any absolute rules here, just tendencies and
Yeah.
guidelines,
Hmm.
because you just wouldn't believe the variety of circumstances.
Yeah.
And as a cautionary note, by the way, just as in following up on that last bit, there have been cases in the past where family, without help, have tried to infiltrate a group, and I've heard of a couple times, I've read a couple times where the person infiltrating became convinced of the group and got involved too. So, there are dangers here
I
with some of
don't
this.
think that families should ever be the ones to, I guess, infiltrate. Um,
Yeah.
I also believe that it should absolutely always be done with professional support.
Right.
With this particular political group, I had full debrief team, therapist, and legal professionals who were advising me.
Right. There you go.
It
Yeah.
absolutely, and as much as I know about influence and control and what's going on in these environments, you can feel kind of messed up after going into these environments because you're
Mhm.
hearing a lot. I mean, you're basically being thrown into behavior modification scenarios, and you have to find a way to be a fly on the wall and make it seem like you're participating, but also not participating so that you're not subjecting yourself to hypnosis or anything like that.
Yeah.
Um, and it should not be done unless you're a professional with this stuff and you have a full debrief team. It just shouldn't be done. And it also should only be done if there are extreme allegations or fears or where action is really needed. Um, so
Yeah.
that's my advice on that. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, there are professional organizations in this space. The International Cultic Studies Association, for example, is an organization that talks about cults and stuff, right? But you don't go to ICSA to get an intervention done or something. But there's a ton of educational resources
Hmm.
and therapy resources and various things
Yeah.
that are connected there. Are there other outfits or organizations in this space beyond ICSA?
Oh, Yes, absolutely. Parents for Peace, for example, we do very similar work to Parents for Peace, and I really need to connect with them more. But
Hmm.
they have like a hotline for families who are concerned about loved ones who've been radicalized into alt-right groups, white supremacy specifically.
Mm.
And they're a nonprofit, so they actually get funding for that sort of work. And I've done consults with families and I've referred them to Parents for Peace. Um, and so there absolutely are. Most of the funding that exists out there are for um, more radicalization based groups. Like the biggest sets of funding goes towards, like in the US for these types of helping organizations, goes towards domestic violence organizations, human trafficking organizations, and anti-terrorism radicalization think tanks and organizations. Um, Obviously, cultic dynamics can exist in any one of those settings, but I encourage people to look beyond just outside of cult related stuff because it is much more limited to what organizations with a lot more grant money behind them can offer in terms of hotline support, even rapid housing, food, you know, benefits and things for people who are transitioning. Um, and sometimes I'll even serve as a consultant as the in-between of, hey, I have a client, they just left this group, and I get in touch with the resource in their county to see if they're able to help with their situation. And most of the time they are.
Excellent. Yeah, exactly. And with in the ex-Scientology world, there's the Mike Rinder Aftermath Foundation, which is
Mhm.
all about post-cult assistance. We don't
Right,
do interventions. That we don't
right.
even go there, right? It's the person has to be wanting to leave or leaving already
Mhm.
when that assistance comes in. So yeah, so there's a wide range of things here, and you've also pointed out, but let me say it out loud that all of this is not just religious based cults. There's
Mhm.
political, ideological, sports groups can turn into cults. I mean,
Yeah.
this can happen in lots of weird ways. It's not just centered around strange religions
Mhm.
or religious beliefs. All right. How do people reach you?
By pigeon carrier only. Um, no, they can reach me at my website, peopleleavecults.com. You can email info@peopleleavecults.com, or you can um, reach me if you live in Portland, Oregon. I volunteer with safe meetups out here for people in the community who've been impacted by high control groups relationships. I'm around. I'm around town. I travel with work, and so who knows? I may be in your area. But yeah, peopleleavecults.com is the best way to reach me.
Excellent. Okay, well, I will
Yeah.
put that link below there. You can see it on the screen. And Ashton, I want to thank you for taking the time today. I wanted to kind of keep this short because I wanted to just put this out there for folks as to like, okay, here's the overview. Here's what we're doing these days. This is
Hmm.
what it's about. It's not old school anymore. We're not part of that. Let me ask you one more thing about this in terms of those ethical guidelines and codes and whatnot. We don't have professional organizations that people register with as cult intervention specialists
Right.
yet. It's still, as I described, a lot of
Yeah.
wild west out there. It's very, individuals taking it upon themselves to uphold their own ethical standards
Hmm.
and methodologies for how to go about doing this. And I happen to feel that what you've described here today is the way to go about this. It's respectful, it's legal, and it is professional, and it involves other
Yeah.
professionals. So it's not just a one man operation
No,
or one woman.
we try to do the best we can to um, you know, provide families with their options. And also, they need to know that we're not their only option. And I don't want to gatekeep this information. I think it's important for people to know. We usually receive cases where recommendations that we've provided or would provide to families, they've tried that and it's not worked. Um, Sometimes this stuff can be worked through in family counseling settings. And we do receive a lot of referrals from therapists who are like, this is a lot more complex than maybe is within my scope, but I'm happy to work with your team to help with this case. And so we really just try to find ways to all come together, work within our skill sets and scope, and help the family as best we can.
Excellent. Excellent. Okay. Well, there you go, folks. I hope you found today's episode informative, educational, and entertaining, maybe a little bit, as always. So thanks for coming around and listening. And if you have any questions at all, of course, you can contact Ashlen through her website. You can write me, askchrisshelton@gmail.com. I am more than happy to refer or assist you in any way with this. And of course, there is the post-cult work that we do with people as well. Yeah. There's the intervention work of let's get the guy out, but and that's going to take whatever it's going to take. But then once they're out, the job's not done when they're out. That's the beginning of the work.
Yeah.
From personal experience, right? It is work, and it is education, and it's often therapy and various things to get past the experience. It's not just get out and it's one and done and we're all good now, Yeah. So just putting that out there for y'all. All right. Again, Ashlen, thank you very much for guesting today.
Yeah, it's been lovely. Thank you.
See you guys soon next week. Bye-bye.
Bye.